12 years of brutal sacrifice vanished in seconds when my founder revoked my equity, sneering, "You're just a mechanic. Be thankful for the paycheck." I didn't argue. I simply sold my private patent to our fiercest rival. 48 hours later, his entire empire collapsed. 12 years. That isn't just a number. It is a biological measurement of cellular decay. It is the permanent ache in my lower lumbar from sleeping under my workbench on a rolled-up yoga mat. It is the lingering smell of burnt flux and ozone that I can't scrub out of my pores. I built the flagship surgical arm for Vertex Biorobotic out of scavenged aluminum and sheer, unadulterated willpower. When the supply chain seized up in 2020 and our CEO, Garrett, was dodging calls from our tooling suppliers, I was the one who took out a $45,000 second mortgage on my townhouse just to keep the prototype powered. We were 3 weeks away from going public on the NASDAQ. The payoff was finally here. My 10% founder's equity was about to convert into a number that would buy back my life, my health, and my house. I was sitting at my terminal, running a final latency diagnostic on the gyroscopic stabilizers, when an email chimed. It was an automated DocuSign receipt, carelessly forwarded by Garrett's assistant Tara. She was always rushing, always making small administrative errors. This one was fatal. I opened the PDF. It was the finalized cap table for the roadshow. I scrolled down to my name. My 10% was gone, slashed to a microscopic 0.2%. Sitting at the top of the ledger, holding my redirected shares, was a newly appointed board member named Preston, a slick 30-year-old venture capitalist whose LinkedIn profile was a masterclass in failing upward. The man had never held a soldering iron in his life. He wore unstructured Italian blazers and spoke in buzzwords. I printed the document. The paper felt heavy in my hand. I walked down the glass-walled corridor to Garrett's office and let myself in. Garrett was leaning back in his Herman Miller chair, pouring sparkling water into a glass. Preston was sitting on the leather sofa opposite him, tapping on an iPad. Neither of them looked up immediately. I dropped the printout on Garrett's desk. He glanced at it, then at me. He didn't flinch. "We had to restructure the cap table for the roadshow," Garrett said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Preston brings Wall Street credibility. Investors want visionaries driving the ship right now, not guys who turn wrenches. I engineered the entire stabilization matrix," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "I mortgaged my home for you to make payroll 3 years ago." Garrett sighed, the kind of heavy, patronizing sigh a parent gives a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "You're a brilliant mechanic, a real workhorse, but you're not the face of a billion-dollar company. You should be thankful for the steady paycheck we provided. Without Vertex, you'd still be tinkering in a garage." Preston didn't even look up from his iPad. That was the exact second my loyalty died. It didn't burn up in a flash of rage. It just turned to ash and blew away. "Understood," I said softly. "I appreciate the transparency." Garrett smiled, relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. "Good man. Now prep the Alpha unit. The FDA inspectors are coming Thursday for the final clearance demonstration. It needs to be flawless." "Absolutely," I replied. I turned and walked out. I went straight to my workbench, picked up my phone, and dialed a number in Switzerland. Dr. Dominic Rael, the head of innovation at Geneva MedTech. They were a massive medical conglomerate, our fiercest rival, and they had been trying to reverse engineer my stabilization algorithms for 5 years. "Dominic," I said when he answered, "is that 8-figure buyout for my gyroscopic calibration patent still available?" I could hear the sudden shift in his breathing. "We can wire the earnest money in 10 minutes. Why the sudden change of heart?" "I decided I'm just a mechanic," I said, "and I'm taking my tools with me." Here is the fatal flaw Garrett overlooked in his arrogance. The proprietary calibration software that kept our robotic scalpels from vibrating at a microscopic level wasn't owned by Vertex Biorobotic. I wrote it in grad school, 2 years before Garrett and I ever incorporated. I held the patent. I had let the company use my personal license keys for 12 years out of blind friendship and a handshake agreement. There was no contract. Vertex had never officially licensed it. I didn't hack anything. I didn't sabotage their servers. I just opened my administrative dashboard and remotely deactivated my private license key. On Wednesday at 5:15 p.m., I walked back into Garrett's office. I dropped my company key card on his keyboard and handed him a single sheet of paper. My resignation. "You can't leave before the FDA inspection," he scoffed, tossing the paper aside. "If you walk out now, I'll make sure you're unhirable in this industry." "I sold my calibration patent to Geneva MedTech this afternoon," I said. Garrett froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked ill. "You signed a non-disclosure agreement, which covers company property, not my personal grad school thesis. Read your own bylaws, Garrett." He stood up. "The surgical arms. How are they supposed to stabilize without the software?" "That sounds like a problem for a visionary," I said, turning toward the door. "I'm sure Preston can talk his way out of it." I boarded a red-eye from San Francisco to Switzerland. I slept for 8 hours straight, the deepest sleep I had experienced in a decade. On Thursday morning, sitting in a sleek, quiet first-class lounge in Zurich, waiting for my connection to Geneva, my phone exploded. News alerts, texts from former colleagues. Without my software, the robotic scalpels had convulsed wildly during the FDOS simulation. The robotic arms had essentially suffered digital seizures, slashing through the synthetic test dummy and destroying the surgical theater. The FDA inspectors walked out in less than 20 minutes. The IPO was dead on arrival. Private institutional investors pulled their backing. Vertex's valuation plummeted $800 million in a single afternoon. Among the chaos on my screen was a frantic, misspelled text from Garrett. "Please, the feds are here. We will give you 20%. Just turn the keys back on." I typed back a single sentence. "Sorry, Garrett, but I lack the polish for international negotiations." I blocked the number, picked up my espresso, and headed toward my new life. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my spacious new office at Geneva MedTech. The view overlooked Lake Geneva, the water gray and perfectly still under the overcast sky. I was reviewing the integration timeline for my software into their hardware line when Dominic knocked on my glass door. He didn't wait for me to answer. He walked in, shut the door behind him, and pulled the blinds down. His expression was entirely unreadable. He walked over to my desk and placed a single document in front of me. It was a court filing. The header was from a federal judge in Delaware. "Adrian," he said quietly, his accent thickening with tension, "did you know Garrett had filed a criminal complaint against you before the FIFTA demonstration?" "Not after." "Before," I frowned, picking up the paper. "What do you mean before?" Dominic leaned over the desk and tapped the timestamp on the top right corner of the page. He knew the software was gone 2 days before the inspection. He filed this us under seal. He let the demonstration happen anyway. He let the machines fail on purpose. I stared at the document. The legal jargon swam in front of my eyes. Wire fraud, corporate espionage, theft of trade secret. Why would he deliberately destroy his own company? The IPO was going to make him a billionaire. Dominic sat down slowly in the guest chair. He looked older than he had yesterday. That's what the FBI is trying to figure out. They've been here this morning, in our legal department. He paused, letting the silence fill the room. The hum of the climate control suddenly sounded deafening. They also want to know, Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, why Preston wired $14 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands the morning of the demonstration, just hours before the company collapsed. He looked at me carefully, the kind of look a man gives someone he suddenly realizes he doesn't know at all, and they want to know why your name appears on that account as a secondary beneficiary. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went numb. I don't have an offshore account. I've never been to the Cayman Islands. I don't even have a passport stamp outside of Europe. The account was opened 6 months ago, Dominic said, with a scan of your passport and a signature that matches your employment contract. The $14 million was the last round of venture capital Vertex raised to bridge them to the IPO. They stole it, I whispered. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Garrett and Preston. They knew the hardware was flawed. They knew the EFTA wasn't going to pass them even with my software smoothing out the errors. The latency issues were deep in the circuit board. They were going to fail the inspection anyway. Dominic watched me, his eyes narrowing. So they needed a scapegoat. They slashed my equity to force me to quit, I said, my voice shaking. My mind was racing backward, replaying the last 6 months, seeing every casual conversation in a sickening new light. They needed a catastrophic event to blame the failure on. They pushed me out, waited for me to pull the license keys, and then used that as the cover story for why the company went under. And they parked the stolen capital in an account with your name on it, Dominic finished, making it look like you sabotaged the company for a payout. I stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it hit the glass wall. We need to call my lawyer. I need to get ahead of this. I have the emails. I have proof I owned the software. Sit down, Adrian, Dominic said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I looked at him. The warmth was gone from his face. He was an executive protecting his own empire now. Geneva MedTech's compliance department has frozen your buyout fund, Dominic said flatly. As of 10 minutes ago, we are cooperating fully with the U.S. Department of Justice. We cannot wire 8 figures to a man currently under federal investigation for corporate sabotage and wire fraud. Dominic, you know I didn't do this. I'm sitting here with you. The money is in the Caymans. I know that, he said softly. But the optics are radioactive. You sold us a patent the same week your former company collapsed, and now the FBI thinks you were paid $14 million to tank their IPO. Our legal team is terminating your contract until your name is cleared. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. I am sorry, Adrian. Truly, you have 48 hours to vacate the corporate apartment. He walked out, leaving the Delaware court filing on my desk. I stood in the silent office for a long time. The gray light from Lake Geneva cast long shadows across the floor. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and dialed Pierce Kellner, a corporate defense attorney back in San Francisco I knew from my early days networking in the Valley. It rang 4 times before he picked up. Adrian, I was wondering when you were going to call. Pierce, you've seen the news. I haven't just seen the news. I've seen the indictment. It was unsealed an hour ago. Pierce's voice was tight, clinical. Where are you? Geneva. Stay there. Do not get on a plane back to the States. If you land at JFK or SFO, you will be in handcuffs before you hit the baggage claim. Pierce, they set me up. Garrett and Preston. They opened a Cayman account in my name. They stole the VC funding. I know, Pierce said. Or rather, I know what the paper trail says. I pulled the file. The signature on the Cayman account authorization, it matches the notary stamp from your second mortgage. My breath caught in my throat. What? 3 years ago, when you took out that $45,000 loan to keep Vertex afloat, Pierce said, the rustle of papers audible over the line. Who brokered that loan for you? I squeezed my eyes shut. The memory was sickeningly clear. I had been sitting in Garrett's office. I was panicked about payroll. Garrett, I whispered. Garrett brought in a private lender. He said he was doing me a favor because the banks were moving too slow. It wasn't a lender, Pierce said grimly. It was a shell company. Garrett has had your notarized financial signatures, your passport scans, and a blank power of attorney for 3 years. He didn't just plan this when he brought Preston on the board. He's had the loaded gun sitting in his desk drawer since 2020. I looked down at the street below. Tiny cars moving in orderly lines, people going about their lives. How much trouble am I in? They have frozen your American bank account, Pierce said. Your checking, your savings, your 401k. Your townhouse is already under a federal asset forfeiture lien. I had nothing. No equity, no buyout money, no home, just the clothes in my suitcase and a few €100 in my wallet. What's our next move? I asked, my voice dropping to a hollow rasp. I need a retainer of $200,000 to even begin fighting the DOJ on this, Pierce said. You have no liquid assets, Adrian. Unless you can access that Cayman account, I can't formally represent you. If I touch that account, I prove their case. Exactly. It's a perfect trap. Pierce sighed. I'll make some calls off the clock, see what I can find out about Preston's movements. But Adrian, you need to find cash fast, because right now, Garrett is sitting in a boardroom playing the victim, and you look like the most successful corporate terrorist of the decade. I hung up the phone and left it sitting on the glass desk. The screen went dark, reflecting the gray clouds rolling over the lake outside. I had no job, no equity, no home, and no access to my own money. I was 34 years old, and my net worth was exactly the €240 folded in my leather wallet. Adrian, I looked up. Dominic was standing in the doorway with 2 men in dark gray suits. Geneva MedTech Security. I need your badge, Dominic said. He didn't look me in the eye this time. He looked at my shoulder. And your company laptop. They will escort you to the lobby. Please don't make this difficult. I didn't argue. I unclipped the plastic badge from my belt and set it next to the Delaware court filing. I closed the lid of the laptop they had issued me exactly 3 weeks ago. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out. The security guards walked a step behind me, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the polished concrete floors of the innovation wing. No one looked at me as I passed the glass-walled lab. The engineers I had been drinking coffee with yesterday suddenly found their monitors incredibly fascinating. I was a ghost. Worse than a ghost, I was a liability. It started raining when I hit the street, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked right through my wool coat. I walked 3 blocks to a Raiffeisen bank branch and shoved my debit card into the ATM. I typed in my PIN and requested a €50 withdrawal, just enough for groceries and a prepaid SIM card. The screen spun a loading wheel for 10 seconds. Then, it flashed red. Transaction denied. Card retained by issuer. The machine ate the plastic. It didn't even give me a receipt. Pierce wasn't exaggerating. The Department of Justice had moved with terrifying speed. Garrett must have handed them a perfectly wrapped package of forged evidence, pointing them directly at me the second the FBI inspectors walked out of that room. I took the tram back to the corporate apartment Dominic had given me 48 hours to vacate. It was a sterile, high-end studio in the Eau Vives neighborhood. I locked the door, took off my wet coat, and sat on the edge of the minimalist bed. I needed to think like an engineer, not a victim. Garrett had the board, he had the VC money, and he had the narrative. But he was a salesman, not a coder. Preston was a finance guy. Neither of them actually understood the stabilization matrix of the surgical arms. They knew how to forge a bank signature, but faking technical logs that would hold up to an FBI cyber forensics team? That required an inside man, someone intimately familiar with the Vertex server architecture. I pulled my personal laptop out of my backpack. It was a battered ThinkPad I had kept separate from the company hardware for exactly this reason. I booted it up and connected to the apartment's Wi-Fi. I opened an encrypted messaging app and typed in a handle I hadn't used since the early startup days. I needed to reach Ellis Voth. Ellis was the lead QA tester at Vertex. He was a paranoid, brilliant guy who kept offline backups of every diagnostic run we ever did because he didn't trust cloud servers. If Garrett had faked the F to failure log, Ellis would know. If the machines were failing because the latency was hard-baked into the circuit boards, Ellis had the data proving it. I typed out a quick message. Ellis, it's Adrian. I need you to look at the Alpha Unit diagnostic logs from the day before the FIFTA test. The hardware was failing before I pulled my license key. You know it was. I hit send, and then I waited. Outside, the rain turned into a downpour, rattling against the floor to ceiling windows. The apartment grew dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there watching the little green checkmark next to my message, waiting for it to turn blue, indicating he had read it. 3 hours later, the screen lit up. Who is this? It's Adrian. I typed back immediately. I'm in Switzerland. I'm locked out of everything. Garrett is setting me up for the 14M missing VC fund. There was a long pause. The typing indicator bubbled up, disappeared, and bubbled up again. You shouldn't be contacting me, Ellis wrote. The feds took our laptops on Thursday. They've been interviewing everyone in QA since Friday morning. Tell them the truth, I replied. Tell them the servomotors had a baseline latency of 400 milliseconds. The arms were vibrating. They were never going to pass FTA clearance. Garrett knew the hardware was dead. The typing indicator appeared again. This time, it stayed there for a full minute. When the message finally came through, the words made my stomach turn over. Adrian, you don't understand what they found. What did they find? The feds didn't just find missing software. They found a malicious payload, a firmware override script executed at 5:18 p.m. on Wednesday, exactly 3 minutes after you handed Garrett your resignation. I stared at the screen. They showed me the server logs in the interview room. Ellis continued. The script overvolted the servomotors. It didn't just remove your stabilization code. It deliberately scrambled the gyroscopes. It caused the machines to violently spasm during the test. And the script was uploaded from your administrative terminal, using your physical MAC address, with your exact keystroke cadence. My hands started shaking. I hovered my fingers over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to type. Garrett hadn't just relied on my software absence to tank the company. He knew that wasn't enough. An absent license key just means the machine won't boot, or it defaults to a safe mode error state. It doesn't cause a robotic arm with a scalpel to tear through a synthetic dummy in front of federal inspectors. To get a catastrophic, visually terrifying failure, the kind that makes investors run screaming and justifies a total company collapse, you have to actively force the machine to destroy itself. I didn't write that script. I typed frantically. Ellis, you know me. I built those arms. I would never write a payload to destroy them. The logs say you did, Ellis replied. And Tara gave a sworn statement to the FBI yesterday. She said she saw you working at your terminal, sweating and agitated, right before you walked into Garrett's office to quit. Tara, the careless assistant who had accidentally forwarded me the cap table showing my equity, was gone. It wasn't an accident. It was the trigger. Garrett needed me angry. He needed me to storm in and quit. He needed me out of the building by 5:15 p.m. so he could sit at my terminal, or have someone else sit there, and execute a pre-written sabotage script using my machine, my IP, and my credential. They had probably been monitoring my keystrokes for months to perfectly mimic my typing cadence. They played me. I typed. The realization suffocating me. Ellis, they engineered the whole thing. Don't message me again, Adrian. Ellis wrote back. I mean it. They're looking at anyone who was close to you. I have a kid. I can't be an accessory to federal wire fraud. Wait, Ellis, who wrote the payload? If I didn't do it, someone else had the technical skill to override the gyroscope. Garrett can't code. There was no response. Ellis, the green dot next to his name turned gray. He had blocked the account. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. The trap wasn't just perfect. It was airtight. They had motive. I was angry about my equity. They had means, my terminal, my credentials. They had the payoff, $14 million sitting in a Cayman account that had my forged signature on the paperwork. My phone buzzed on the desk. I flinched, staring at it. It was a generic international number. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up. Hello, I said, my voice hoarse. Adrian. The voice was smooth, relaxed, and dripping with absolute confidence. It was Preston, the venture capitalist who had orchestrated my ruin. How did you get this number? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Oh, come on, Adrian. You're an engineer. You know how easy it is to track a ping from a Swiss cell tower when you have the right friends in telecom. Preston chuckled, a soft, rich sound. I hear Geneva is beautiful in the rain. You and Garrett are going to federal prison, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You think you can hide $14 million in the Caymans? The DOJ tracks everything. Actually, the DOJ tracks exactly what we tell them to track, Preston said, casually. And right now, they are very, very focused on a disgruntled founder who threw a tantrum, sabotaged a billion-dollar medical device, and tried to flee to a non-extradition country with the remaining Series C funding. Switzerland extradites for wire fraud. Preston, you're not as smart as you think. No, but they don't extradite for corporate espionage if the intellectual property was legally transferred prior to the incident. You really muddied the waters by selling that patent to Dominic. It's a jurisdictional nightmare. It'll take the feds 2 years just to untangle the subpoenas. He paused, and I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass. He was celebrating. I'm calling to offer you a way out, Adrian, because despite what you think, we aren't completely heartless. A way out, I repeated bitterly. The 14 million in that Cayman account, it's fully accessible to you. The FBI knows it exists, but they haven't frozen it yet because of the offshore banking privacy laws. You have the account number. You have the routing details in your email. I made sure Tara sent them to your personal Gmail yesterday. Check your spam folder. I opened my laptop and pulled up my email. I clicked the spam folder. There it was. An email from an encrypted server containing a PDF of a Cayman Islands banking ledger. If you touch that money, you prove their case, Pierce had told me. Why would you give me access to the money you stole? I asked. Because we don't care about the 14 million, Adrian, Preston said, his voice dropping its playful edge. The 14 million is chump change. It's the cost of doing business. Garrett and I didn't tank Vertex to steal a bridge loan. I frowned, staring at the rain lashing against the glass. Then why? Because of what Vertex owns, Preston said softly. Or rather, what we are about to sell out of bankruptcy. We hold the exclusive military contracting rights to the stabilization chassis. The Pentagon didn't care about the surgical scalpel. They care about the robotic arm. They want to mount it on drones for remote ordnance defusal. We just secured a silent, non-compete defense contract worth $800 million. The air left my lung. But to pivot the company from medical to defense, we had to get rid of the original cap table, Preston explained patiently, like a teacher speaking to a slow student. We had to wipe out the early investors, the medical board, and you. The easiest way to do that was a catastrophic, public failure that bankrupted the medical division, allowing a new holding company, owned entirely by Garrett and myself, to buy the underlying patents for pennies on the dollar out of receivership. They didn't just steal the company. They killed it so they could harvest its organs. So take the 14 million, Adrian, Preston said. Transfer it to a cold wallet. Disappear into Eastern Europe or South America. Live like a king. If you try to fight us, you will run out of money before your lawyer even files the first motion. If you come back to the States, you go to prison for 20 years. You're a mechanic. Take your severance and walk away. The line went dead. I kept the phone pressed to my ear for a long time after the line went dead, just listening to the hollow static of the international connection. He wants me to take the money. It's the perfect bow on their narrative. If I touch that Cayman account, the wire transfer flags in the international banking system, I become a fugitive. The DOJ stops looking at Garrett and Preston and puts all their resources into hunting me. I put the phone down on the glass desk. I looked at my reflection in the window. I looked tired, beaten, just a mechanic who got played by the suits. But Preston had just made his first mistake. He talked. He couldn't resist gloating. I picked up my phone and called Pierce back. That was fast, Pierce said. Did you find 200 grand in the couch cushions? Preston just called me, I said. Silence on the line. Then, tell me you recorded it. I'm on a burner app on a laptop, Pierce. I didn't have time. But he told me everything. It's not about the medical EPO. They tanked Vertex to wipe the cap table so they could buy the IP out of bankruptcy. They have an $800 million defense contract lined up for the stabilization chassis. Remote ordnance defusal. Pierce let out a long, slow breath. Defense, Jesus. That elevates this from standard sec fraud to defrauding the Pentagon. If they pulled that off, they're insulated. The DoD protects its contractors, but they need the tech to work, I said. My mind finally shifting out of panic and back into engineering mode. They destroyed the alpha units to fake my sabotage. Now they have to rebuild the chassis for the military. But Preston and Garrett don't know how to build it. They have your schematics, Pierce pointed out. Schematics are just pictures, I said. The stabilization matrix isn't just software. It's the physical calibration of the servomotor, the exact tension of the aluminum joints, the torque specification. I never wrote those down in the company database. I kept them in my head, and I did the final calibrations by hand. If they try to build a new chassis using just the blueprints and the new software they intend to write, the arms will tear themselves apart again. How long until they figure that out? Depends on how fast the military wants a demonstration. I can find that out, Pierce said. His voice had lost its clinical detachment. He smelled blood in the water. I have a contact at the duty procurement office. Let me make a few calls. But Adrian, listen to me carefully. Do not stay in that corporate apartment. Dominic is cooperating with the Fed. If the Swiss authorities get a provisional arrest warrant, they'll come right to that address. I'm leaving now, I said. You have 200 euros. Where are you going to go? I'll figure it out. Just find out when Garrett's military demo is. I hung up. I looked around the sterile, high-end studio. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my laptops and spare clothes inside, and walked out. I didn't leave the keycard. I dropped it down a storm drain 3 blocks away. I walked through the rain to the Cornevin train station. The concourse was crowded, smelling of wet wool, stale coffee, and ozone from the tracks. I found a cheap hostel in the Pockies district, a gritty neighborhood just north of the station. I paid for 4 nights in cash, 80 euros. The desk clerk didn't ask for a passport, just handed me a physical key attached to a heavy block of wood. Room 12. It was barely wider than the twin bed inside. The walls were thin, and I could hear the rumble of the trams outside. I sat on the mattress, pulled out my battered ThinkPad, and opened a secure browser. I couldn't contact anyone in software or QA. Ellis had made that clear. They were compromised, terrified, or bought off. But Vertex wasn't just coders. We had a machine shop, a cavernous space on the ground floor of our San Francisco building where the actual metal was milled and bent. I pulled up a messaging app and typed in a number I knew by heart. Duncan Mercer, the head machinist, a 50-year-old guy with a permanent scowl, missing the tip of his left index finger, who hated the corporate side of Vertex with a fiery passion. He tolerated me because I actually knew how to use a CNC machine and didn't mind getting cutting fluid on my shoes. Duncan, it's Adrian. I waited. It was early morning in San Francisco. He would be in the shop drinking his first thermos of black coffee before the suits arrived. 10 minutes passed. Then, my screen pinged. You've got a lot of nerve reaching out, kid. Feds practically took a core sample of my hard drives yesterday. I didn't write the payload, Duncan. Garrett and Preston framed me. They stole the Series C money, and they're pivoting the chassis to a DoD contract. There was a long pause. I could picture Duncan standing by the massive Haas milling machine, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, staring at his phone. I know you didn't write it, Duncan replied, because the payload was sloppy. You don't do sloppy. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Are they trying to rebuild the alpha units? Trying is the operative word, Duncan wrote. Preston brought in a team of contractors from Lockheed over the weekend. Guys in suits who think they can engineer a dynamic mechanical system by staring at a CAD file. They've been trying to machine new joints for the past 48 hours. And and they're stripping the gears. The tolerance is off by a fraction of a millimeter. Every time they power up the test rig, the gyros overcompensate and snap the drive belts. Garrett was down here an hour ago screaming at them. They have a closed-door demonstration for a 2-star general in 9 days. If they don't have a working physical prototype, the duty walk. 9 days. Garrett had played a brilliant legal and financial game. He had rigged the cap table, forged the Cayman documents, and perfectly executed a corporate assassination. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the physical reality of the product he was selling. He thought the hardware was just a shell for the software. He didn't understand that the metal had its own physics. Duncan, I typed. The torque specs and the micro-calibration notes. The ones I kept in the red spiral notebook. Yeah, I remember it. You never let it out of your sight. I didn't take it with me when I quit, I wrote. I left it locked in the bottom drawer of my secondary workbench, the one in the back corner of the machine shop. The feds wouldn't have looked there because it's technically your area, not mine. Let me check. I stared at the screen for 20 agonizing minutes. The tram rattled past the window, shaking the thin glass. My battery dipped to 60%. Finally, Duncan messaged back. It's here. Drawer was still locked. I jimmied it open, got the red notebook. Destroy it, I typed. Burn it, shred it, drop it in the chemical solvent tank. If Garrett finds that notebook, he has everything he needs to make the prototype work for the military demo. If he doesn't have it, the arms will keep tearing themselves apart and the dude will pull the $800 million contract. He'll be left with nothing but a bankrupt medical company and a mountain of federal inquiry. I waited for Duncan's reply. I needed him to do this. He was the only one who could pull the pin on Garrett's entire scheme. The typing indicator bubbled up. I can't do that, Adrian, Duncan wrote. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why not? Duncan, they stole my life. They stole the company. Because Garrett isn't the one looking for it, Duncan replied. Preston came down to the shop floor while I was holding it. He brought 2 of those private security guys he hired. He said if I didn't hand over every scrap of paper with your handwriting on it, he'd hand the feds security footage showing me disabling the shop cameras the night before the F-Day test. You disabled the cameras? Why? Because I was running side jobs on the milling machines to pay for my wife's medical bills, Duncan wrote. It's a federal offense to misuse equipment financed by Duty Grant. Preston knew. He threatened to hand me to the FBI if I didn't give him the notebook. I'm sorry, Adrian, I really am. But I gave it to him 10 minutes ago. They have the calibration specs. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. They had the notebook. They had the physical calibration. Garrett and Preston didn't just have the narrative and the money anymore. Now, they actually had the ability to deliver the hardware. They were going to win. They were going to walk away with nearly $1 billion in government funding, and I was going to be hunted by Interpol for the rest of my life over $14 million I never touched. My phone buzzed. It was Pierce. I picked it up. They have the calibration spec, I said, my voice hollow. Duncan gave them my physical notes. They're going to make the 9-day deadline for the military demo. We have a bigger problem than the demo, Pierce said. He didn't sound clinical anymore. He sounded alarmed. I just got off the phone with my guy at the DOJ. What is it? The Cayman account. Adrian, the one in your name. I told you, I haven't touched it. I know you haven't, Pierce said grimly. But someone did. An hour ago, a wire transfer was initiated from that account. $4 million was moved to a private bank in Zurich, and the authorization signature used to release the funds? It wasn't your forged paperwork from Garrett. Then what was it? I asked, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. It was the biometric authorization from your personal license key dashboard, Pierce said. The exact same digital signature you used to shut down the software before you left. The feds just got the ping. They think you're cashing out. The Swiss authorities aren't waiting for a provisional warrant anymore, Adrian. They've escalated it to active flight risk. Interpol just issued a red notice. I closed my eyes. The rumble of the tram outside faded into a low white noise. A red notice. I couldn't walk down the street, couldn't buy a coffee, couldn't cross a border. Garrett and Preston had closed the final loop. They had painted me as a fugitive, cashing out his sabotage money, and the international police were coming to collect the prize. But as the panic washed over me, a very cold, very quiet clarity took its place. The clarity of a mechanic looking at a intentionally broken machine. Preston was a venture capitalist. He understood ledgers, leverage, and legal loopholes. He thought of software as a static tool, a padlock. You copy the key, you open the lock, you take the money. He didn't understand what he had actually used. The biometric authorization he hijacked to initiate that wire transfer wasn't just a digital signature. It was tied to the master dashboard of my grad school calibration software. I built that dashboard 12 years ago, back when I was a paranoid student terrified of corporate espionage. I didn't just build it to grant access. I built it to hunt pirates. I pulled the battered ThinkPad onto my lap. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I opened the encrypted terminal shell and bypassed the graphical interface entirely, diving straight into the raw database of my personal server. I pulled the authentication logs for the last 24 hours. There it was, a massive data packet executed exactly 50 minutes ago, initiating the $4 million wire transfer to Zurich. Preston had captured my biometric hash when I logged in to shut down the surgical arms on Wednesday, and he had just injected that exact code string into the Cayman Bank's verification portal. It was a classic replay attack, and it worked perfectly on the bank, but it also triggered the silent trapdoor I had hard-coded into the license dashboard. When my biometric hash is executed from an unrecognized IP address, the software doesn't block the transaction. It lets it go through, but it silently executes an aggressive telemetry sweep on the host machine. I typed in the decryption key and hit enter. The command prompt unspooled a wall of green text. It had pulled the IP address. It had pulled the physical MAC address of the network card. It had pulled the internal routing table, and it had triggered the host machine's webcam, capturing a silent 2-second burst of raw video frame. I opened the media file. The screen flickered, and there he was. Preston. He was sitting at Garrett's mahogany desk in the Vertex Executive Suite in San Francisco. He was holding an encrypted USB drive, looking down at his laptop screen with a smug, self-satisfied smile. On the desk next to him was a glass of sparkling water and the red spiral notebook Duncan had surrendered. Preston had literally taken a high-definition selfie while committing federal wire fraud. I picked up my phone and took it off mute. Pierce, are you still there? I'm here, Pierce said, his voice tight. I'm looking at flight manifests to non-extradition countries. We might have a window before the Swiss police get the physical warrant to the canton. I'm not running, I said. I'm sending you an encrypted file folder. I need you to forward it to your contact at the DOJ right now. Adrian, what is it? It's the digital fingerprint of the wire transfer, I said. Preston used my biometric hash, but he didn't realize my software takes a forensic snapshot of the machine running it. I have the IP address, the MAC address, and a crystal clear photograph of Preston executing the transfer from Garrett's office. It proves I didn't touch the Cayman account. It proves Preston framed me. Silence stretched over the line. When Pierce spoke again, the panic was gone. The shark was back. Send it. I hit send. There's one more thing, I said, leaning back against the cheap headboard. Your guy at the Doody. Tell him to make sure the 2-star general attends Garrett's demonstration next week. Tell him to bring a front row seat. Why? Pierce asked. Duncan gave them your notebook. They have the physical calibration spec for the chassis. The notebook contains the physical torque requirements, I explained. But the hardware and the software are a symbiotic system. The metal is inherently unstable under load. My software doesn't just smooth out the bump, it predicts the microfractures in the gyroscopes and compensates milliseconds before they happen. Lockheed can't write that software in 9 days. Without my algorithm, applying the exact physical torque specs from that notebook will actually amplify the kinetic feedback loop. Meaning, if they build those arms exactly the way my notebook tells them to, and they power them up with generic software, the machines won't just vibrate, I said. They will tear themselves to pieces. 9 days later, I was sitting in a private conference room at the U.S. consulate in Geneva. Pierce had flown in the day before. The red notice had been quietly suspended, though the DOJ hadn't officially cleared me yet. They were waiting to see what happened in a reinforced testing bunker at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Pierce's laptop was open on the table. We had a secure audio feed patched through his Dottie contact. We listened as Garrett's voice echoed through the bunker, smooth and confident. He gave a visionary speech about the future of remote ordnance defusal. He talked about keeping soldiers safe. He introduced the newly rebuilt Vertex chassis, praising his team's tireless engineering. Then, he gave the order to power up the unit. Through the audio feed, we heard the heavy clunk of the primary contactors engaging. Then, the high-pitched whine of the servomotors spooling up to full military voltage. For 3 seconds, there was a steady hum. Then, the kinetic feedback loop started. It began as a low rattle. Over the audio feed, we heard someone, it sounded like Preston, yell for them to cut the power. But it was too late. The gyroscopes overcompensated. The torque built exponentially. There was a deafening metallic screech, followed by the violent sound of heavy aluminum snapping under immense pressure. Drive belts cracked like gunshots. Shrapnel clattered against the bunker's safety glass. Kill it. Kill the main breaker. Garrett was screaming. The audio feed cut to static. Pierce quietly closed his laptop. He looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. I think the demonstration is over. 3 hours later, the FBI raided the Vertex headquarters in San Francisco. They seized the servers, Preston's laptop, and Garrett's financial records. With the exact IP and MAC address I had provided, the cyber forensics team matched the Cayman wire transfer to Preston's machine in less than 20 minutes. The video frames of Preston sitting at the desk sealed it. By midnight Pacific time, Garrett and Preston were in federal custody, charged with defrauding investors, wire fraud, and attempting to defraud the Department of Defense. The next morning, I walked out of the U.S. consulate into the bright Geneva sunlight. The rain had finally stopped. The air off the lake was crisp and clean. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was Dominic. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I wasn't just a mechanic anymore, and I certainly wasn't going back to being an employee. I had the patent, I had the algorithm, and I knew a 2-star general at the Pentagon who was suddenly in the market for a functioning robotic stabilization chassis. I walked down toward the water, pulled out the phone again, and called Pierce. We had a defense company to build.